The acoustic guitar string snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and 200 people in the MTV studio gasped as one. Kurt Cobain was 3 songs into the most important performance of Nirvana's career, and his guitar had just died. What happened in the next 90 seconds would create the most iconic unplugged moment in television history, proving that true artistry doesn't need perfection, it needs courage. It was November 18, 1993, and Kurt Cobain was sitting on a small stage at Sony Music Studios in New York City, surrounded by candles and lilies that made the set look more like a funeral than a rock concert. MTV Unplugged was the show that separated real musicians from studio-manufactured pop stars, and Kurt knew that millions of people would judge Nirvana by what happened in this room tonight. The invitation to perform on MTV Unplugged had arrived 6 months earlier, and Kurt's initial reaction had been to refuse. Unplugged was for artists like Eric Clapton and Mariah Carey, polished professionals who could strip their songs down to acoustic arrangements without losing their power. Nirvana was different. Their music was built on distortion, feedback, and the kind of raw energy that came from Marshall amplifiers pushed past their breaking point. "We're not an acoustic band," Kurt had told his manager. "Our songs don't work without the noise." But Dave Grohl, Nirvana's drummer, had seen things differently. "That's exactly why we should do it," Dave had argued. "Everyone expects us to fail at this. Let's prove them wrong." Kurt had eventually agreed, but with conditions. He refused to play Nirvana's biggest hits in their recognizable forms. No Smells Like Teen Spirit, no Come As You Are. Instead, he wanted to play covers of obscure songs, deep album cuts, and reimagined versions of Nirvana tracks that most fans had never heard. MTV executives had been horrified. The whole point of Unplugged was to showcase an artist's greatest hits in intimate acoustic versions. But Kurt was adamant. If they wanted Nirvana, they'd get Nirvana on Nirvana's terms. Weird, uncomfortable, and uncompromising. The compromise they'd reached was fragile. Kurt would play some Nirvana songs, but he'd also include covers from the Meat Puppets, David Bowie, and Leadbelly. The set list was bizarre and risky, the kind of programming that could either be brilliant or career-destroying. Rehearsals had been tense. Kurt had shown up late to every session, often hungover, sometimes barely able to hold his guitar. The acoustic instruments felt foreign in his hands after years of electric guitars. The Martin D18E guitar he'd borrowed for the performance was beautiful but temperamental, and Kurt hadn't had time to properly break it in. But what nobody knew, not MTV, not his bandmates, not even Courtney Love, who was watching nervously from the wings, was that Kurt had a secret plan for this performance. He was going to prove that Nirvana's power came from something deeper than amplifiers and distortion. He was going to show the world that raw emotion could cut through any production, any polish, any commercial expectation. Now, on the actual night of the taping, that plan was falling apart string by string. The show had started well enough. Kurt had opened with About a Girl, an early Nirvana song that worked surprisingly well in acoustic form. His voice, usually buried under walls of guitar noise, was naked and vulnerable. The studio audience of 200 people, mostly MTV employees and music industry insiders, had listened in respectful silence. Then came Come As You Are, reimagined with a haunting acoustic arrangement that made the familiar song sound like a completely different piece of music. Kurt's fingers moved across the fretboard with a delicacy that surprised everyone who knew him only as a grunge icon. The third song was Jesus Doesn't Want Me for a Sunbeam, a cover of a Vaseline song that most of the audience had never heard. This was vintage Kurt, deliberately obscure, deliberately uncommercial, deliberately challenging anyone who just wanted to hear the hits. He was halfway through the second verse when it happened. The high E string, already stressed from Kurt's aggressive playing style, finally gave up. It snapped with a sharp crack that echoed through the studio's carefully calibrated acoustics. The note Kurt was playing turned into a discordant thud, and his fingers kept moving for a fraction of a second before muscle memory caught up with reality. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Kurt's hands froze on the guitar. His eyes, which had been closed in concentration, snapped open. He stared down at the broken string, dangling uselessly from the headstock, and for a moment, his face was completely blank. This was the nightmare scenario. MTV Unplugged was recorded live to tape with minimal editing. There were no second takes, no do-overs, no studio magic to fix mistakes. Whatever happened in this room would be what aired on television. And Kurt Cobain's guitar had just broken during the third song of a 14-song set list. In the control room, MTV producers were already reaching for their headsets, ready to call a break and find a replacement guitar. The show's director was calculating how much time they'd lose, whether they'd need to reshoot the entire performance, whether Kurt would even be willing to start over. Dave Grohl, sitting behind his drum kit, felt his stomach drop. He'd seen Kurt shut down before when things went wrong, watched him walk off stage in the middle of regular concerts when technical problems disrupted his concentration. This performance was already pushing Kurt's comfort zone. A broken string might be the excuse he needed to call the whole thing off. Chris Novoselic, Nirvana's bassist, caught Kurt's eye from across the stage. The look they shared contained years of friendship, hundreds of shows, countless moments when everything had gone wrong and they'd had to decide whether to fight through it or give up. But what happened next wasn't what anyone expected. Kurt didn't stop playing. His right hand continued strumming, adjusting instinctively to the absence of the high string. His left hand modified the chord shapes, finding new voicings that worked with 5 strings instead of 6. The song, "Jesus Doesn't Want Me for a Sunbeam," continued without pause, its melody line now carried entirely by the remaining strings and Kurt's voice. The audience barely had time to process what they were witnessing. One second there had been a crisis. The next second, Kurt was still playing as if nothing had happened, as if the song had always been meant for a 5-string guitar. But it wasn't just that he kept playing, it was how he kept playing. Kurt leaned into the limitation. Instead of trying to replicate what the song had sounded like with 6 strings, he reimagined it on the fly. His strumming pattern changed, becoming more percussive, more rhythmic. His vocal delivery intensified, filling the space where the high string's brightness had been. The broken string became part of the performance, adding a raw, unfinished quality that actually enhanced the song's emotional impact. It was like watching a painter who'd run out of one color and discovered that the limitation made the artwork more powerful. From the wings, Courtney Love watched with tears streaming down her face. She'd seen Kurt's insecurity, his perfectionism, his tendency to sabotage himself when things didn't go exactly right. But here he was, turning disaster into art in real time. When the song ended, the studio audience erupted in applause that was different from normal concert applause. This wasn't just appreciation for a good performance. This was recognition of something extraordinary. Watching a master artist demonstrate complete control of his craft under the worst possible circumstances. Kurt looked up from his guitar for the first time since the string had broken. His expression was hard to read, part relief, part defiance, part something else that looked almost like joy. "Guitar's broken," he said into his microphone, his voice carrying that distinctive Kurt Cobain mixture of vulnerability and fuck you attitude. But we're not stopping. MTV producers in the control room looked at each other in disbelief. They'd expected Kurt to demand a replacement guitar, to take a break, to throw a rock star tantrum. Instead, he was announcing his intention to continue with a broken instrument. "Kurt," the director's voice came through the stage monitors, "we can get you another guitar. We can take 5 minutes." "No," Kurt interrupted, speaking into his mic so everyone in the studio could hear. "This is the guitar. This is the show. We keep going." What Kurt understood in that moment, what made his decision so radical, was that perfection was the enemy of what Nirvana represented. The whole point of their music, the entire ethos of the grunge movement, was about embracing imperfection, celebrating the rough edges, finding beauty in things that were broken. By continuing with a broken guitar, Kurt was making a statement louder than any lyrics he could sing. He was telling MTV, telling the music industry, telling everyone watching that real artistry doesn't require perfect conditions. It requires truth. The next song was The Man Who Sold the World, David Bowie's classic that Nirvana had been performing in concert for years. But no one had ever heard it like this. Acoustic, vulnerable, and now missing 1/6 of its sonic palette. Kurt's 5-string guitar forced him to completely rearrange the song's iconic riff. Notes that would have been on the high E string had to be found elsewhere on the fretboard, creating new voicings, new harmonics, new textures. The song became stranger, darker, more unsettling than any version Bowie had ever recorded. And Kurt's voice, my God, his voice. Without the full guitar to hide behind, Kurt's vocal performance became the centerpiece of every song. He sang with a rawness that most artists spend entire careers trying to achieve, his voice cracking in all the right places, finding power in vulnerability rather than volume. By the 5th song, Penny Royal Tea, the broken string had become the performance's defining characteristic. Music critics watching from the audience were already mentally writing reviews about how Kurt Cobain had turned technical failure into artistic triumph. But the real test was still coming. The 7th song on the set list was All Apologies, one of Nirvana's most emotionally complex songs, a track that balanced aggression with tenderness, anger with vulnerability. It was a song that depended on the full range of the guitar, on the ability to move from delicate fingerpicking to powerful strumming. With a broken high string, the song should have been impossible. Kurt started playing the opening notes, and immediately everyone could hear that something was different. The characteristic brightness of All Apologies was gone, replaced by a darker, more muted tone. The song sounded like it was being played underwater, like it was reaching the audience through layers of distance and sadness. Kurt closed his eyes and sang, "What else should I be? All Apologies." His voice carried every ounce of pain, confusion, and defiance that had defined his entire career. The broken guitar wasn't limiting him, it was freeing him. Without the expectation of perfection, he could be completely honest. The studio audience wasn't just listening anymore. They were witnessing something that transcended performance, something that felt more like prayer or confession than entertainment. Chris Novoselic's bass lines wrapped around Kurt's 5 strings, filling in harmonic spaces, creating a fuller sound than should have been possible. Dave Grohl's brushwork on the drums was so delicate it was almost invisible, just enough rhythm to anchor the song without overwhelming its fragility. The 3 of them, Kurt, Chris, and Dave, had played together for so many years that they could communicate without words. In this moment, they were all understanding the same thing. The broken string wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a gift. When All Apologies ended, Kurt opened his eyes and looked directly into the camera for the first time all night. His gaze was intense, almost confrontational, as if he was daring MTV to cut away, daring the audience to stop watching, daring anyone to suggest that what was happening wasn't good enough. Then he did something that would become one of the most analyzed moments in MTV Unplugged history. He reached up to the broken high E string, grabbed the loose end that was dangling from the headstock, and pulled it completely off the guitar. He held it up for the camera to see, a thin piece of metal that represented everything the music industry thought he needed to be successful. And then he dropped it on the stage floor. "Don't need it," he said into the microphone. The statement was about more than just a guitar string. It was about every commercial expectation, every pressure to conform, every person who had told Kurt Cobain that he needed to be something other than exactly what he was. The final 7 songs of the set list were performed on that 5-string guitar, and each one was extraordinary. Kurt had stopped trying to work around the missing string and had instead embraced it, building arrangements that used the limitation as a feature rather than a bug. When the show ended with "Where Did You Sleep Last Night?", a haunting lead-belly cover that Kurt sang with such raw intensity that several audience members were openly crying, the entire studio erupted in a standing ovation that lasted for over 5 minutes. MTV executives, who had been terrified that the broken string would ruin their carefully produced show, realized they had something unprecedented, a performance that would be talked about for decades. Not in spite of its technical problems, but because of them. The MTV Unplugged episode featuring Nirvana aired 6 weeks later and became the highest-rated Unplugged broadcast in the show's history. Critics called it the definitive Nirvana performance, the moment when Kurt Cobain proved he was more than just a grunge icon. He was a genuine artist. But the real impact of that broken string went deeper than ratings or reviews. Kurt's decision to continue playing, to refuse a replacement guitar, to actually remove the broken string rather than trying to hide the problem, all of it became a defining moment for an entire generation of musicians who learned that authenticity matters more than perfection. Guitar companies started receiving requests from young musicians asking for 5-string guitars like Kurt used on Unplugged. Music teachers began telling students about the night Kurt Cobain turned disaster into triumph. The broken string became a symbol of artistic integrity, of the courage to be vulnerable, of the power of embracing your limitations. Kurt himself rarely talked about that night. In one interview a few months later, he was asked about the broken string, and he simply said, "It was the guitar I had. It was the guitar I played. That's all." But to everyone who was there, everyone who watched the broadcast, everyone who has discovered that performance in the years since, it was everything. It was proof that the most powerful moments in art often come from imperfection, that limitations can inspire creativity in ways that unlimited resources never could. The MTV Unplugged album, released after Kurt's death in 1994, became one of the best-selling live albums in history. That 5-string guitar performance became the definitive version of songs like All Apologies and The Man Who Sold the World, overshadowing even Nirvana's studio recordings. Today, the Martin D18E guitar that Kurt played that night, still with only 5 strings, is valued at over $6 million. But its real value isn't monetary, it's what it represents. A moment when one artist refused to accept that perfection was necessary for greatness. Kurt Cobain taught us that night that the cracks are where the light gets in, that broken things can be more beautiful than polished ones, and that true artistry isn't about having everything work perfectly, it's about having the courage to continue when everything goes wrong. The guitar string that snapped during MTV Unplugged was supposed to ruin the most important performance of Nirvana's career. Instead, it created the most legendary moment in the show's history. Because Kurt Cobain understood something that most artists never learn. You don't need perfection when you have truth.